Have you ever closed your eyes and wished for a love so perfect it felt like it was ripped straight from the pages of a fairy tale? The kind of love that makes your heart race, your palms sweat, and your soul ache with the sheer weight of its beauty? For years, Emma believed that kind of love only existed in books' sweet, fleeting fantasies meant for dreamers, not for someone like her. She had buried her hopes under layers of disappointment, convincing herself that real love was messy, painful, and nothing like the stories she adored. But then he walked into her life, and in one earth-shattering moment, everything she thought she knew about love was turned upside down. This isn't just another love story. This is the story of how one man defied every expectation, shattered every doubt, and proved that fairy tales aren't just for children, they're for those brave enough to believe in them. If you've ever felt like love has let you down, like you're destined to settle for something less than magic, then you need to hear what happened next. Because what started as an ordinary day for Emma spiraled into something so extraordinary, so breathtakingly real, that it will make you question whether destiny has been quietly writing your love story all along. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone and instantly known they were going to change your life? That's exactly how Emma felt the moment she locked eyes with him. But here's the twist. He wasn't the charming prince she'd imagined. He wasn't sweeping her off her feet with grand gestures or poetic declarations. No, this was different. This was deeper. This was the kind of love that crept in quietly, like sunlight breaking through the cracks of a broken heart piece by piece, until one day she realized she couldn't remember what life was like before him. But before we get to the happily ever after, we have to talk about the storm that came first. Because nothing worth having comes easy, and Emma's love story? It was no exception. There were secret ones that threatened to tear them apart before they even began. There were moments so dark, so suffocating, that walking away would have been the easiest choice. And yet she stayed. He stayed. But why? What was it about this love that made it worth fighting for when everything else in the world was screaming at them to let go? I know what you're thinking. Tell me the answer already. And trust me, I will. But first, you need to understand just how close Emma came to losing it all. Because the truth? It's more shocking than anything she could have imagined. And by the time this story is over, you'll be left wondering, could this kind of love exist for me too? So, are you ready? Take a deep breath. This is where the fairy tale ends and where real love begins. Emma had spent years building a life that made sense, one where love was a distant concept, something she observed from the sidelines but never truly experienced. Her days were predictable. Mornings at the cafe where she worked. Afternoons lost in the pages of novels at the bookstore. Evenings alone in her tiny apartment with only her cat and her thoughts for company. She told herself she was content, that the ache in her chest whenever she saw couples laughing together was just nostalgia for a fantasy that never existed. But then, on an ordinary Tuesday, the bell above the bookstore door chimed, and everything changed. He didn't stride in like some romantic hero. He slipped in quietly, shaking rain from his coat, his gaze scanning the shelves with an intensity that made Emma pause. There was something about him, an unreadable depth in his eyes, a quiet confidence in the way he moved that pulled at her curiosity like a thread she couldn't resist tugging. Their first conversation was nothing extraordinary, just a casual exchange about a book he couldn't find, but the way he listened, really listened, when she spoke unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. Most people nodded along, waiting for their turn to talk, but he absorbed her words like they mattered. And when he smiled, it wasn't the polished grin of someone trying to charm her. It was slow, genuine, as if she'd surprised him somehow. By the time he left, Emma found herself staring at the door long after it closed behind him, her heart pounding with a strange mix of anticipation and fear. She didn't even know his name, yet somehow she already knew he wasn't the kind of person who walked out of a life unchanged. What she didn't know was that he'd noticed her too long before that day. Later, she'd learned that he'd been coming into the bookstore for weeks, always when she was working, always lingering just a little too long near the fiction section where she usually sat. He'd memorized the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was lost in a book, the way her nose scrunched when she disagreed with a character's choices. But he hadn't approached her, not until that rainy afternoon. And when she asked him why, his answer would send a shiver down her spine, because I knew once I talked to you, there'd be no going back. As days turned into weeks, their connection deepened in ways Emma couldn't have predicted. They talked for hours about everything and nothing: childhood dreams, favorite songs, the kind of fears that only surface in the dark. He had a way of drawing her out, of making her feel seen in a world where she'd always felt invisible. But just as she began to let her guard down, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade started to show. The way he stiffened at certain questions, the phone calls he took outside with hushed, urgent tones, the shadows that crossed his face when he thought she wasn't looking. She told herself it was nothing, that everyone had their secrets. But then the nightmares started, not hers, but his. She'd wake to find him gasping in the dark, his hands clenched into fists, whispering a name she didn't recognize. When she asked, he'd pull her close and change the subject, his voice steady but his hands trembling against her skin. And then there were the letters. Emma found the first one by accident, tucked into the pocket of a jacket he'd left at her apartment. It was addressed to him in elegant, looping handwriting, the paper faintly scented with perfume. She hadn't meant to read it, but one word caught her eye, promise, and before she could stop herself, she'd unfolded it. The words were cryptic, more like a puzzle than a message. You know what you have to do. She's waiting. Don't forget what's at stake. No signature, no return address, just that single line that left her stomach in knots. When she confronted him, his reaction was all wrong, too calm, too calculated. He took the letter from her with a quiet apology, calling it an old misunderstanding, but his eyes were distant, like he was already somewhere else. That night, for the first time, he didn't stay over. He kissed her forehead, told her he'd see her tomorrow, and walked out into the rain without looking back. Emma tried to shake off the unease, to convince herself she was overreacting, but the universe had other plans. The next morning, a stranger walked into the bookstore, a woman with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. She didn't browse the shelves or ask for recommendations. She walked straight to Emma and slid a photograph across the counter. The image was grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking the man who'd turned her world upside down or the woman clinging to his arm, her face buried in his shoulder. "You should know who you're really dealing with," the stranger said, her voice low and deliberate. "Before it's too late." And just like that, she was gone, leaving Emma with more questions than answers and a sinking feeling that the fairy tale she'd started to believe in was far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The worst part? She couldn't bring herself to walk away. Because despite the secrets, despite the gnawing doubt in her chest, she'd felt something real between them, something too powerful to ignore. But real love isn't just about the blissful moments. It's about what happens when the shadows creep in. And as Emma would soon discover, the truth has a way of revealing itself at the worst possible time. Because that photograph wasn't just a warning. It was a piece of a puzzle that would lead her down a path she never saw coming, one where love and lies were tangled so tightly that pulling one thread could unravel every twist in love story, dark secrets in relationships, unexpected plot twists, emotional roller coaster, love and betrayal. Mysterious past, gripping romance, suspenseful storytelling, shocking revelations, dramatic love story thing. Twist in love story, dark secrets in relationships, unexpected plot twists, emotional roller coaster, love and betrayal. Mysterious past, gripping romance, suspenseful storytelling, shocking revelations, dramatic love story. Emma stared at the photograph in her hands, the edges crumpling under her grip as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. The man in the picture was unmistakably him, the same sharp jawline, the same way his shoulders tensed when he was uncomfortable. But the woman beside him was a stranger, her face hidden yet her body language screaming intimacy. The image burned itself into Emma's memory, each second stretching into an eternity as she replayed every moment they'd shared, searching for clues she might have missed. Had his late-night disappearances been more than just stress? Were the whispered phone calls something darker than she'd imagined? The questions gnawed at her, but beneath the hurt, something else pulsed, an unshakable certainty that there had to be more to the story. Because the man she'd fallen for wasn't a liar. At least, that's what she'd believed until now. That evening, she waited for him at their usual spot, a dimly lit bench in the park where they'd shared secrets under the stars. When he finally appeared, his steps slower than usual, the shadows under his eyes deeper, she didn't greet him with a smile. Instead, she held out the photograph, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Who is she?" The silence that followed was heavier than any denial. He didn't flinch, didn't look away, just exhaled slowly as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Her name is Leela," he said finally, his voice rough. "And if I tell you the truth, you'll never look at me the same way again." Emma's breath caught. This wasn't the confession of a cheating lover. It was the tone of a man carrying a weight too heavy to name. Before he could continue, his phone buzzed, a single, insistent vibration. He glanced at the screen and his face paled. "They know," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Then, gripping her wrist with sudden urgency, he pulled her close. "Listen to me. There's no time to explain, but you need to trust me. That woman who gave you the photo? She's not who you think. And neither am I." Before Emma could demand answers, the world erupted into chaos. A car screeched to a halt nearby, doors slamming, footsteps pounding toward them. He shoved her behind him just as two figures emerged from the darkness. Not the police, not some jealous ex, but men dressed in black, their faces obscured, their movements precise. "Run," he hissed, shoving a key into her hand. "Go to the address on this, don't stop, don't look back." Then he was gone, lunging toward the strangers with a ferocity that left her frozen. The last thing she saw before she turned and fled was the glint of metal in the moonlight. Not a gun, but a badge. The address led her to a crumbling brownstone on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place people didn't ask questions about. Inside, she found a single room lit by a flickering bulb, walls covered in newspaper clippings and red string. And at the center of it all, staring back at her from a dozen photos, was her own face. Her coffee shop. Her apartment. Her walks home. Someone had been watching her long before he ever walked into that bookstore. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about him. It was about her. Scrawled on the mirror in jagged letters was a message that made her blood run cold. "They'll come for you next." Back in the safety of her apartment, Emma clutched the key he'd given her, her mind spinning. Who was Leela, really? Why were armed men chasing him? And why was she a target? The man she thought she knew had vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions and a single terrifying truth: nothing about their love story had been an accident. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word had been leading to this moment. And the worst part? She still loved him. Even now, with the evidence of his deception staring her in the face, her heart refused to let go. Because somewhere in the lies, there had been something real. She was sure of it. But certainty wouldn't save her. Not when the knock came at her door at 3 a.m. Not when the voice on the other side whispered a name she'd only heard once before: Lila. And as Emma pressed her eye to the peephole, the face staring back wasn't a stranger's. It was hers. Shocking plot twist, dangerous love story, secret identity revealed, high-stakes romance, mysterious past exposed, suspenseful storytelling, unexpected betrayal, gripping drama, intense emotional conflict, can't miss climax. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she stared through the peephole, her reflection staring back at her, except it wasn't her reflection at all. The woman on the other side of the door had her face, her hair, even the same slight scar above her eyebrow from a childhood fall. But the eyes were different, cold, calculating, filled with a quiet fury that made Emma's blood run cold. Before she could react, the door swung open, and the woman Lila stepped inside, pressing a finger to her lips in warning. "If you scream, if you run, they'll kill us both," she whispered. her voice eerily familiar yet laced with a hardness Emma didn't recognize. The pieces began to click together in a way that made her stomach twist. The photograph, the surveillance, the men chasing him, none of it was about an affair. It was about her. Or rather, the woman who shared her face. Leela moved with practiced precision, locking the door behind her and pulling the curtains shut before turning to Emma with a grim expression. "You weren't supposed to meet him," she said, her words sharp. "He was only watching you because of me. Because we thought they might come for you next." Emma's mind reeled as Leela explained the truth. They were twins, separated at birth, their existence kept secret by a shadowy organization that had used Leela as an operative for years. The man Emma had fallen for wasn't just a stranger with a mysterious past. He was a detective who had been working undercover to bring the organization down, and he'd been tasked with protecting Emma when they realized Leela had gone rogue, taking sensitive information with her. The photograph, the letters, the late-night disappearances, it had all been part of a mission Emma had never known she was part of. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Every tender moment, every whispered confession had been tangled in a web of lies. But as she looked at Leela, her sister, her mirror image, she saw something unexpected flicker in the other woman's eyes. Regret. "I didn't know they'd drag you into this," Leela admitted, her voice cracking for the first time. "But now that you're involved, there's only one way out." She pressed a flash drive into Emma's hand, the weight of it feeling like a death sentence. "This is what they're after. Give it to him. He'll know what to do." Before Emma could respond, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the bedroom window. Leela's head snapped up, her body tensing. "Too late?" she muttered, shoving Emma toward the back door. "Go! Now!" Emma ran, her heart pounding in her ears. The flash drive clutched so tightly it left marks in her palm. She didn't stop until she reached the park where they'd first met, her lungs burning, her mind racing. And then, as if the universe had scripted it, he was there, bruised, bleeding, but alive. His eyes widened when he saw her, relief and guilt warring in his expression. "Emma," he breathed, reaching for her, but she stepped back, holding up the flash drive like a shield. "Tell me the truth," she demanded, her voice shaking. Was any of it real? For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gaze raw with unspoken emotion. Then, slowly, he nodded. The mission wasn't. But this, he gestured between them, his hand trembling. This was never part of the plan. Emma wanted to hate him, to walk away and never look back. But as the sound of sirens grew closer, as the weight of everything she'd learned settled over her, she realized something. Love wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, painful, and sometimes built on lies. But that didn't make it any less real. In the end, she handed him the flash drive, their fingers brushing for what might be the last time. "Finish this," she whispered. And then she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the shadows where their story had begun. The epilogue came months later, in the form of a newspaper headline, "Corrupt Organization Exposed, Key Operatives Arrested." There was no mention of her, or him, or Leela, just the quiet closure of a chapter she'd never asked to be part of. Emma returned to her bookstore, to her quiet life, but something had shifted. She no longer believed in fairy tales. But maybe, just maybe, she believed in second chances. Unbelievable twist ending, emotional story resolution, shocking truth revealed. Love these. Lies, dramatic finale, unforgettable climax, heart-wrenching choices, powerful storytelling, must-watch conclusion, deep emotional impact.